Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, let me tell you the thing that has kept me up since I first heard this one. It isn't the boat, and it isn't the man who rigged it. It's a question a 7-year-old asked from the back seat of a car, in that small, careful voice kids use when they already suspect the answer is going to change everything. Dad, if Uncle Joe says something is our little secret, do I have to keep it even from you? That's the whole story, right there. A little boy trying to be good, trying to keep a promise, sitting on top of something that could have gotten a woman killed. What I love about the man in this story is that he didn't explode. He didn't scream. He didn't call his brother-in-law and start a fight in a driveway. He was a gas safety technician, a man who spends his life finding invisible leaks, and he treated a murder plot the exact same way he'd treat a bad fitting on a propane line. Calm hands. Follow the smell back to the crack. Let the truth come to you. So today we're going to talk about secrets, the good kind and the poison kind, about how the quietest person in the room is very often the most dangerous one to underestimate, and about a father who taught his son that love never, ever asks you to keep a secret that leaves you all alone with it. Stay with me. Brady Kilmer made his living finding things that could kill you and never made a sound. For 19 years, he had run Kilmer Gas and Marine Safety out of a tin-roofed shop at the edge of Wardlow, New Hampshire, a 2-stoplight town that curled around the south end of Mallow Lake like a cupped hand around a coal. In the winter, he pressure-tested the propane lines that heated half the cabins on the water. In the summer, he crawled into the engine boxes and galley lockers of every boat at the 3 marinas on the lake, sniffing for the sweet rot of a gas leak, tightening fittings, replacing the little carbon monoxide detectors that people ripped out because they beeped when the coffee burned. He was not a big man and not a loud one. He had a way of going quiet and still when other men got loud, and the men who worked the docks had learned that when Brady got quiet it was because something was actually wrong. He liked to say that gas doesn't lie. Fire announces itself. Water announces itself. But gas just waits in the low places and fills the room while everybody's asleep. And the only way to beat it is to be the kind of person who checks, who follows the faint wrong smell back to its source, instead of opening a window and forgetting about it. His whole life was built on the belief that the invisible things are the ones that get you, and that patience beats panic every single time. He had learned that belief the hard way, the way the true ones always get learned. 22 years old, first winter on the job, a rental cabin out on the west arm of the lake, a young couple up for a snowy weekend. The furnace exhaust had been shimmed with the wrong flashing by a handyman in a hurry the summer before, and nobody checked it because it hadn't leaked yet. And things that haven't leaked yet feel exactly like things that never will. Brady had been the one sent out Monday morning when they didn't check out. He'd been the one to open the door. He never talked about what he found in that cabin. Not to Claire, not to anyone. But he'd walked out of it a different man than the one who walked in. And the difference was this. He stopped believing that quiet meant safe. He got his certifications, all of them, the ones nobody on the lake bothered with. He bought instruments other technicians laughed at, and he developed the habit that made him strange and made him good, the habit of assuming that the calmest-looking system in the room was the one busy killing you, and going and checking it anyway, every time, no matter who rolled their eyes. That cabin was why. He'd promised the 2 people he found in it, silently, that he would spend his life being the man who checks. He had no idea that promise was going to come due one day, with his own family standing in the blast radius. He had married up. Everyone in Wardlow agreed, though Claire Kilmer would have smacked anyone who said it in front of her. Claire had grown up in Ardsley, and the Ardsleys were old lake money, or what passed for it in a town like Wardlow. Her father, Angus Ardsley, had built half the docks on the North Shore with his own hands back before the tourists came. And when his hands finally gave out, he'd sold the marine hardware business and put the money into a trust for his 2 daughters and, more importantly, for any grandchildren who came after. The trust owned the big shingled lake house on Heron Point, the one with the wraparound porch and the deep-water boathouse, and it owned a fat block of the shoreline that a developer would have chewed off his own arm to get at. Angus was 81 now, sharp as a fishhook and twice as hard to shake off, and he loved exactly 3 things in the world: his lake, his granddaughter, and his grandson, and being right. The lake house had gone to his older daughter, Deborah, on the understanding that it stayed in the family, and the shoreline trust rolled down to the grandchildren. That was the money. That mattered later, though nobody was thinking about money the weekend it started. They were thinking about a fishing trip. Deborah Marsh was Claire's older sister, and where Claire was flint, Deb was warmth. She ran the little bakery on Main that smelled like cinnamon at 5 in the morning, and she'd never once in her life assumed a person meant her harm, which is a lovely way to move through the world right up until it isn't. 3 years back, Deb had married a man named Joe Marsh, and the whole town had thrown them a party at the boathouse. Joe was a charmer, a big, handsome fishing guide with a laugh you could hear across the water and a photograph of every trophy bass he'd ever netted. He ran Marsh Guide Service out of the Heron Point boathouse, took city men out at dawn for money, and told stories at the tavern that got better every time he told them. Danny, Brady's 7-year-old, thought Uncle Joe hung the moon. Joe let him drive the boat sitting on his lap. Joe called him first mate. So when Joe offered to take Danny for a boys' fishing weekend at the lake house, just the two of them and Aunt Deb, Danny had packed his little duffel 3 days early and slept in his life jacket. Brady drove him out on a Friday, kissed the top of his head, watched him run down to the dock hollering, and drove home to a quiet house feeling nothing but the ordinary ache of a father whose kid is growing up. He had no idea he had just dropped his son into the middle of another man's plan. What Brady didn't know, what nobody in Wardlow knew, was that Joe Marsh was drowning, not in the lake. In money, Marsh Guide Service had looked like a business and functioned like a slow leak. Joe had borrowed against the boats, borrowed against boats he didn't even own free and clear, and funneled the mess through a shell he'd named Northreach Holdings because it sounded like something a serious man would own. He owed people the kind of money that doesn't send letters, it sends men. And somewhere in the middle of that slow catastrophe, Joe had met a woman named Vivian Lorne, who had come up from Boston to look at lakefront property and stayed to look at Joe. Vivian had expensive taste and a cold, clear way of doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic she'd done on Joe's life had a very specific answer. Deb owned the lake house. Deb sat at the top of a trust, and Deb, sweet trusting Deb, had recently let her husband talk her into getting the family's affairs in order, which had involved a nice man from Granite Mutual Life and a stack of forms she'd signed without reading, because why would you read them? They were just insurance. And Joe said it was the responsible thing to do. She had not noticed the number on the policy. She had not noticed the beneficiary. Her husband had, though. Her husband thought about that number the way Brady thought about a leak he couldn't yet see. Joe Marsh had not started out a monster, which is the uncomfortable truth about most of them. He'd started out a boy who was good at being liked and bad at being told no, and those two things had walked him, step by easy step, to the edge of a very high place. The guide business had been real once, a good idea run by a man with no stomach for the parts of a business that aren't fun. He spent on boats he wanted instead of boats he needed. He comped trips for men he wanted to impress. He'd taken a hard loan 2 winters back to cover a soft one, and then a harder loan to cover that, until the paper he owed had been bought and sold and ended up in the hands of men who ran a sportsman's finance operation out of a marina 3 lakes over and did not accept apologies. In July, 2 of them had come to Heron Point in a bass boat that cost more than Joe's house, and sat on his dock drinking his beer and explaining, very politely, that the vig was now the whole business, and the whole business was now theirs, unless Joe could find real money, real soon, the kind of money that doesn't come from netting base for dentists. Joe had smiled and shaken their hands and watched them idle away, and then he'd sat on the end of his dock in the dark for a long time. And somewhere in that dark the idea had come to him, whole and cold, the way the worst ideas do. His wife was worth more asleep than he would ever be awake. All he had to do was make the lake do the killing, and the lake killed people every single year, and nobody ever called it anything but sad. Vivian Lorne did not put that idea in his head, but she was the one who sharpened it into a plan. She'd come up from Boston in June to scout lakefront for a development group, seen the Heron Point shoreline, and understood in one afternoon that it was the last unbroken stretch of buildable water in the county and worth a genuine fortune to the right buyer. She'd also seen Joe and understood him just as fast. A handsome, frightened man standing on top of an asset he didn't legally control, married to the woman who did. Over dinners he couldn't afford. Vivian had walked Joe through the arithmetic with the patience of an accountant and the warmth of a lover, and by the end of it, Joe believed 2 things that weren't quite true. that Deb's death would drop the shoreline into his hands, and that Vivian loved him. Only one of those beliefs would survive the summer. The plan Joe had built was almost elegant, and it turned on the one thing Joe understood better than any other on that lake, because he'd sat through Brady's dockside safety talks a dozen times bored out of his skull. Carbon monoxide. Every cabin cruiser on Mallow Lake had a little propane heater for the cold dawns, and every one of them had a carbon monoxide detector bolted to the bulkhead, because a running heater or a idling engine in an enclosed cabin will fill that space with a gas you cannot see, cannot smell, cannot taste, a gas that just makes you sleepy and then makes you gone. Deb's boat, the Kingfisher, a cozy 26-foot cruiser with a snug little cabin, was going to take Deb and Joe out for their wedding anniversary the following weekend, and overnight, anchored in the quiet cove on the far shore under the stars. That was the story Joe told everyone, and it was a beautiful story. Deb had told it to Danny all weekend, how romantic, an anniversary on the water. And Danny, being 7 and helpful and in love with his uncle, had been recruited into the surprise. He'd helped Uncle Joe carry a heavy new propane bottle down to the boathouse. He'd helped him tuck a little plastic box into a bag, the box that beeps, and Uncle Joe had crouched down and looked him in the eye and said, "This is our little secret, first mate." A surprise for Aunt Deb. You can't tell anybody. Not your mom, not even your dad. Secrets are how you know you're really part of the crew. And Danny, wanting so badly to be part of the crew, had said okay. He'd carried it all weekend like a stone in his shoe. The weekend itself had been, from the outside, everything a 7-year-old dreams of. They'd fished the misty dawns when the bass were biting, and Uncle Joe had whooped and hollered and let Danny reel in a smallmouth almost as long as his arm, and they'd fried it up with Aunt Deb's cornmeal and eaten it on the porch. Joe was a wonderful uncle when it cost him nothing, and it had cost him nothing to be wonderful, because a happy, adoring kid was exactly the kind of helper a man like Joe could use without the kid ever knowing what he'd helped with. That was the part that would make Brady sickest, later, when he understood it. Joe had chosen Danny. He'd wanted a small, trusting pair of hands to carry the propane bottle so it wouldn't be on the marina's camera as Joe's, and a small, trusting mouth he could seal with the magic word secret, and a small, trusting witness who, if it ever came to it, could be waved away as a confused little boy. He'd wrapped a murder weapon in a fishing trip and handed it to a child, and the child had thought it was the best weekend of his life. On the last night, Danny had lain awake in the bunk room listening to the loons and thinking about the little box in the rafters, the box that beeps, and the way Uncle Joe's face had gone hard for just a second when he said, "Not even your dad," and Danny hadn't had the words for the feeling in his stomach, but the feeling had a name, and the name was wrong. He'd almost told Aunt Deb at breakfast. He'd opened his mouth and then remembered he was supposed to be part of the crew, and closed it again. He would think about that almost, that opened and closed mouth, for the rest of his childhood, until his father gave him the only thing that ever made it bearable, which was the truth that he had told the right person in the end, and that the end was what counted. Brady picked Danny up on Sunday afternoon. The boy was sunburned and happy and full of stories, and for the first 20 minutes of the drive home he narrated the entire weekend, every fish, every wave, the way Uncle Joe let him steer. Brady drove and smiled and made the right noises. Then, somewhere on the county road where the trees closed over the asphalt and the light went green and underwater, Danny got quiet. Brady felt it before he heard it, the way the temperature of the car seemed to drop. In the rearview mirror, his son was looking out the window with a small, pinched face that did not belong on a 7-year-old. And after a long minute, Danny said, in a voice so careful it broke Brady's heart, "Dad, can I ask you something? But it's kind of a secret, so I don't know if I'm allowed." Brady kept his voice easy. "You can always ask me anything, bud." And Danny asked the question that turned the whole world over. "If Uncle Joe says something is our little secret, do I have to keep it even from you?" Brady did not slam the brakes. That was the first of 100 small choices he'd make right, over the next 2 weeks, that added up to a woman still being alive. He put on his blinker like a man with all the time in the world, pulled onto the gravel shoulder under the green trees, put the car in park, and turned all the way around in his seat so his son could see his whole face. "Danny," he said, "look at me. There is no such thing as a secret you have to keep from your mom and dad. Not one. Some surprises are fun, like a birthday present. And those have a day when everybody finds out, and that's what makes them okay. But if a grown-up ever tells you to keep a secret from me forever, from your own dad, then that grown-up is the one doing something wrong, and telling me is not tattling. Telling me is the bravest thing you can do. You will never, ever be in trouble with me for telling me the truth. Never. Now, what's the secret? And in the green underwater light of that pulled-over car, Danny told him. It came out in a child's order, which is to say, backwards and sideways, and all at once. There was a lady at the lake house, a lady who wasn't Aunt Deb, and she came in a shiny car when Aunt Deb went to town, and Uncle Joe kissed her by the boathouse, and Danny wasn't supposed to see. And there was the surprise for Aunt Deb, the anniversary surprise, and Danny had helped. He'd carried the heavy silver can, the propane, down the ramp, and he'd helped hide the little box, the box that beeps when there's bad air. Uncle Joe took the batteries and the guts out of it and put it in a bag way up in the rafters, and he said the beeping would ruin the surprise, and it was their secret, and Danny wasn't supposed to tell, not even Dad. And Danny had kept it all weekend, and it had made his tummy hurt, and he didn't know why. Brady listened to all of it with his professional face on, the still calm face he wore inside an engine box, while every word landed in him like a stone dropping into a well. A pulled carbon monoxide detector, a swapped propane bottle, an enclosed cabin, an overnight, anchored, in a cove, a woman asleep below while her husband stayed up on deck where the air was clean. Brady had spent 19 years learning exactly how a person dies in that scenario, and how the coroner writes it up as a tragic accident, faulty heater, so sad they never felt a thing. He looked at his son's frightened, honest face, and he understood that Danny had just, without knowing it, described a murder. And it was scheduled. "You did so good," Brady said, and he made sure his voice didn't shake, because a shaking voice would have told Danny the truth was even bigger than he feared. "You did the bravest, best thing. I'm so proud of you I could bust. That was never your secret to carry, okay? It's mine now. I've got it." He reached back and squeezed the small sneakered foot. Then he turned around, put the car in gear, checked his mirror, and pulled a slow, careful U-turn on the empty county road, back toward the lake. He took his phone out of the cup holder, and with one hand on the wheel and his son watching him in the mirror, he called the Wardlow County Sheriff's non-emergency line, and when the dispatcher picked up, he said, in the flat, even voice of a man reading a pressure gauge, "My name is Brady Kilmer. I'm a licensed gas safety technician. I have a witness account that someone has disabled the carbon monoxide alarm and altered the propane system on an occupied vessel on Mallow Lake, and I have reason to believe it's intended to kill the boat's owner within the week. I need to talk to a detective, not a deputy, and I need to do it before Sunday's over." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a professional recognizing another professional, and then a woman's voice said, "Sir, stay on the line. I'm getting you Detective Delgado." He called Claire next, and this was harder, because Claire was fire where Brady was still water, and Claire's first instinct when someone threatened her family was to go straight at them. He caught her before she got in her own car. He told her the shape of it in 6 sentences, and he could hear her breathing change, could hear the Ardsley temper come up in her like a squall line, and he said the thing he needed her to hear more than anything. "Claire, if we do this loud, we lose. If you call Deb, if you go over there swinging, Joe smells it, and either he runs or he moves it up, and either way your sister's in more danger, not less. I need you to be the strongest thing you've ever been, which is quiet. Can you do that for Deb?" And there was a long silence on the line, the hardest silence of their marriage, and then Claire let out a breath that shook, and said, "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." And Brady loved her so much in that moment he could hardly speak, because he knew what it cost her. He knew that every hour she spent smiling at Joe Marsh over pie, knowing what she knew, would take something out of her she'd never fully get back. That was the price of doing it right, and both of them paid it, and they never once complained, because the alternative was a funeral. Danny, in the back seat, watched his father make the calls and somehow understood that he had done something enormous, and that it was going to be okay, and both of those things were true. Brady would spend the next 2 weeks making sure the second one stayed true. By the time Brady turned up the long gravel drive to Heron Point, the sun was slanting gold across the water, and Joe Marsh was standing on the porch of the lake house, with a beer in his hand and a grin on his face, and Brady had already decided the hardest thing he would decide that whole 2 weeks. He was going to smile back. Because the fastest way to get Deb killed was to accuse Joe now, in the driveway, with nothing but a 7-year-old story. Joe was charming, and Joe was loved, and Joe had spent 3 years building himself into everybody's favorite guy. And a good lawyer would turn Danny's account into a confused kid's misunderstanding before the ink was dry. A pulled alarm is faulty equipment. A new propane bottle is routine maintenance. Even the lady by the boathouse was, on its own, just an affair. Ugly, but not illegal. Brady had learned a long time ago that you don't fix a leak by shouting at the pipe. You find it, you prove it, you make it undeniable, and then you shut it off at the source, where it can't come back. So he got out of the car and let Danny run to his mother, who'd driven over separately, and he shook Joe Marsh's hand and said the truck's making a noise. Mind if I take a look at the Kingfisher's heater while I'm here? You know me. Can't stop working. And Joe, who had no idea the ground had already shifted under him, laughed his big laugh and said, "That's what I love about you, Brady, always checking." Detective Kurt Delgado met him at the marina an hour later, a lean, tired man in his 50s who'd worked 20 years of lake country deaths and had exactly 0 patience for the ones that turned out to be arranged. He listened to Brady's account, leaning against his unmarked car, chewing a toothpick, and when Brady finished, Delgado said the thing Brady already knew. A kid's statement and a missing alarm won't get me a warrant, and it sure won't get me a conviction. Marsh's people will say the boy's confused and the equipment failed. If you're right, I don't just want to stop it, I want the man who built it. Brady nodded slowly. This was a language he understood. Then let me do what I actually do, he said. Let me service that boat, officially. I'll document every altered component with my own instruments. Photograph it, log it, chain of custody, the whole thing, same as if I were testifying about a warehouse explosion. And I'll stall the anniversary trip. I'll tell Deb the heater's got a fault and I need to order a part. That buys us a week. You find out why. Find out what he stands to gain. Delgado studied him for a long moment, then spat the toothpick into the gravel. You're a cold one, Kilmer. No, Brady said, watching the light die on the water. I just don't panic in the low places. That's where the gas is. That evening, with Deb up at the house cutting a pie and Joe holding court on the porch, Brady climbed down into the Kingfisher's little cabin alone, with a work light and a camera and a spiral notebook, and read the boat like a confession. It was all there, exactly as a 7-year-old had described it. The carbon monoxide detector on the bulkhead was a hollow shell. Someone had unscrewed it, gutted the sensor and the battery, and reseated the empty case so it looked, at a glance, like it was still guarding the room. The propane bottle in the locker was brand new, and, when Brady checked the stamp, deliberately wrong, a higher pressure fill mated to a regulator someone had swapped for a cheaper model that would seep. And the little heater's exhaust vent, the flue that was supposed to carry the deadly gas out of the cabin, had been carefully, almost lovingly, sealed at the fitting with a smear of clear silicone, so that a running heater would send its invisible poison not up and out into the night air, but sideways, into the cabin, into the bunk where a sleeping woman would breathe it and simply not wake up. Brady sat back on his heels in that snug little space that smelled of varnish and lake water, and looked at the trap somebody had built for a woman who made him cinnamon rolls, and something went very cold and very steady in his chest. He photographed all of it. He bagged the gutted detector. He wrote the time and the date, and then he reassembled everything exactly as he'd found it, silicone and all, so that when Joe came down to check his handiwork, he'd find it untouched and feel safe. You don't tip the leak that it's been found. You let it keep talking. The next morning, Brady told Deb, gently, that the Kingfisher's cabin heater had a fault in the flue and it wasn't safe to run overnight, and that he'd feel a lot better if he serviced it properly before the anniversary trip, and could they push it out a week. Deb was disappointed, but she trusted Brady completely, and she said, of course, safety first, that's my brother-in-law. Joe, standing behind her drying a coffee cup, went very still for just a second. A stillness Brady caught in the reflection of the window over the sink. The stillness of a man recalculating. Flue fault, huh? Joe said. Easy as anything. Good thing you check. Always, Brady said, and held his eyes half a beat too long, and then smiled and asked if there was any of that pie left. But driving home, he knew he'd started a clock. Joe now had a reason to worry. and a worried man either quits or hurries, and Brady's whole plan depended on figuring out which, before Joe did something faster and uglier than the patient poison he'd built. Joe hurried. Brady had been afraid he would. 3 days after the flu conversation, Brady got a call at the shop from Corey Massey, the fuel dock kid, talking fast and low. Mr. Marsh was down at the boathouse with the Kingfisher's engine cover off, and he'd told Deb they should just go tonight. Forget the repair. It was their anniversary, and Brady was being paranoid. He'd take a look at the heater himself. Deb was up at the house packing an overnight bag. Brady's blood went to ice water. If Joe took her out tonight, on a boat Joe had fixed himself, there'd be no cameras, no logger, no proof, just a sad accident in a cove and a widower with a story. Brady did the calm thing, the fast calm thing. He didn't call Joe. He called Deb, warm and ordinary, and told her he was so sorry but the part he'd ordered for the heater had come in wrong, and he could not in good conscience certify that boat's cabin heater safe to run overnight, and that he'd feel terrible if anything happened, and would she please just wait for the real repair, as a favor to him. And Deb, who trusted Brady's word on safety over her own husband's, told Joe she wasn't going to run a heater Brady hadn't cleared, and that was that. Brady heard, later, from Corey, that Joe had put his fist through the boathouse wall after she said it. A small hole, quickly patched. But it told Brady everything he needed to know about how close the edge was, and how little time he had, and how badly he could not afford a single loud move. He'd bought a week with a phone call. He did not intend to waste an hour of it. He got his first real break from a 19-year-old at the fuel dock. Corey Massey pumped gas and coiled lines at the Heron Point Marina, and idolized Joe Marsh the way half the boys on the lake did, but Corey had a conscience that wouldn't quit itching him, and when Brady came by to order a part, he found the kid pale and jumpy. It took 2 conversations, and a promise that he wasn't in trouble, but it came out. 3 weeks back, Joe had paid Corey $40 to help him carry a heater and some fittings down to the Kingfisher after hours, and had told him, real friendly, real firm, to keep it between them. And there'd been a woman more than once, a Boston plate Audi, and Joe kissing her against the boathouse door thinking nobody was on the water at dusk. Corey had seen it from a kayak. "I didn't know what to do, man," the kid said, near tears. "He's my boss. Aunt Deb, everybody loves her. She gives us day-olds from the bakery." Brady put a hand on his shoulder. "You know exactly what to do," he said. "You already did the first part. You told the truth when it was scary. Now you're going to tell it to a detective, and I'm going to be right there, and Joe Marsh is never going to know it was you until it's far too late to matter." Corey wiped his face and nodded, and Brady felt the leak grow one crack wider, one witness stronger. The why came from Marla Devane, and it was worse than Brady had let himself imagine. Devane was a state insurance fraud investigator, a small, precise woman with a filing cabinet memory, and Delgado had pulled her in the moment Brady used the words propane and insurance in the same breath, because a rigged accident on an insured life is her whole reason for existing. It took her 4 days of quiet paper pulling. Then she sat Brady and Delgado down in a back booth at the diner and laid it out like a hand of cards. 6 weeks ago, Joe Marsh had taken Deb to a Granite Mutual agent and had her sign a new life policy, replacing a small, old one, more than doubling the payout, with a double indemnity rider that paid twice the face value in the event of accidental death. Sole beneficiary, Joseph Marsh. 2 weeks after that, Joe had quietly borrowed against the guide business one more time, which meant he was either about to lose everything or about to come into a great deal of money. And Northreach Holdings, his shell, had a second, stranger asset, a purchase and sale agreement, unsigned, for the entire Heron Point shoreline, the trust land, with a Boston Development LLC, whose managing member was one Vivian Lorne. "He can't sell the shoreline," Marla said, tapping the page. "It's in the grandkids' trust. He doesn't control it. Unless the trustee, Deborah, is dead, and the whole thing collapses up to the surviving spouse in the mess, before the trust lawyers untangle it, which he's clearly been told it would, wrongly, by somebody who wanted to believe it. He's not just killing her for the insurance, gentlemen. He thinks he's killing her for the land. He's got a buyer, and the buyer is the woman he's sleeping with." Marla had put it together the way she put everything together, one boring true document at a time. She had started at Granite Mutual and found the agent, a nervous young man who remembered the marshes because Joe had done all the talking, and Deb had signed where she was told, and because Joe had asked a very particular question about how fast the double indemnity rider paid on an accidental death, and whether a boating accident counted, and the agent had thought it was a strange thing for a fishing guide to worry about but had answered it, and had felt vaguely sick about the whole meeting ever since without knowing why. She had pulled the loan filings on Northreach and watched the debt climb like a fever chart. She had found the Boston LLC and the unsigned land agreement and matched the managing member to a hotel folio at the Wardlow Inn, 3 separate weeks, a room Joe Marsh had paid for in cash. People think fraud is complicated, Marla told Brady, closing her folder. It almost never is. It is just greed that kept a receipt, and this man kept every receipt there is. He doubled a policy, borrowed against a business that is already gone, and lined up a buyer for land he does not own. All in 6 weeks, all pointing at the exact same date on the calendar. A jury does not need to be a genius to see that. They just need to be shown it in order. And showing things in order was, as it happened, exactly what Brady Kilmer did for a living. Brady looked out the diner window at the lake his father-in-law had spent his whole life loving, and understood that Joe Marsh had planned to poison Deb, cash a policy, sell her father's shoreline out from under her own children, and sail off into a new life with the woman who'd done the math. And he understood, too, with a strange cold clarity, that a man who'd built something this greedy and this precise would not be talked out of it. He'd have to be walked into it. Telling Deb was the worst thing Brady ever did, and he did it in Claire's kitchen, with Claire holding her sister's hands. He didn't dramatize it. He laid it out the way Marla had, the way you'd explain a fault to an owner. Here is the tamper on your boat. Here is the pulled alarm your own nephew helped hide. Here is the woman. Here is the policy. Here is the land your father left your children. And here is what your husband intends to do with all of it. Deb didn't cry at first. She got very quiet, the Ardsley quiet, and then she asked to see the photographs, and Brady showed her the gutted detector and the silicone in the flue, and she looked at the picture of the sealed vent for a long time, and then she said, in a voice Brady would never forget, "He kissed me goodnight every night this week." And then she cried, once, hard, and then she stopped, and wiped her face, and said, "What do you need me to do?" And that was the moment Brady knew Joe Marsh had already lost, because he'd married a woman he thought was soft, and softness and strength are not opposites, and the man had fatally confused the two. The plan they built was Brady's kind of plan, which is to say it was patient, and it turned the thing itself into the trap. Delgado's problem had always been intent. A tampered boat could be argued as an accident, but a man caught in the act of arming it, on camera, could not. So they would give Joe exactly the night he'd been planning, and let him build his own gallows. Deb would tell Joe, tearfully reconciled after a manufactured little fight, that she wanted to do the anniversary trip after all. This weekend, just the two of them, the cove, the stars, like he'd wanted. Joe would rearm the boat, because Brady's repair would have undone his work, and this time every move he made would be recorded. Brady, wearing his safety tech's hat in front of God and everybody, would certify the heater repaired and safe, giving Joe the confidence to go through with it. But the Kingfisher's cabin would be wired, 2 hidden cameras, and Brady's own touch, a concealed carbon monoxide data logger, a real one, a professional instrument that would silently record the gas climbing to a lethal level as proof of exactly what the sealed flue was designed to do. And Deb would never be in that cabin at all. She'd be on shore with Delgado and Marla and a tactical team, watching a screen, while the bunk below held a weighted decoy and a thermal dummy under the blanket. Joe would poison a mannequin, on camera, having disabled the safety on an occupied vessel with intent, and the gas he trusted to keep his secret would testify against him in numbers no lawyer could cross-examine. "You want to catch a man who hides in the invisible," Brady told Delgado. "You make the invisible visible, and you let him walk right into it thinking he's alone." Building the trap took Brady 2 nights of careful work, done between midnight and 4 while Joe slept and the lake lay black and still. He treated the Kingfisher the way he'd treat evidence in a fatal explosion case, because that, God willing, was exactly what it would become. He mounted the 2 little cameras where a man arming a rig would never look, one in the ceiling of the cabin behind a smoke-stained vent grill, one outside under the gunnel aimed at the heater locker. He set the real carbon monoxide logger, a calibrated instrument the size of a deck of cards, high in the cabin where the gas would pool first, and he ran its thin wire to a transmitter hidden in the bilge, so that every part per million would stream to the laptop in the blind on shore and write itself into a file with a timestamp no defense lawyer could argue with. Then he built the decoy, a weighted form the size of a sleeping woman, a heater pad set to body temperature, so a nervous man checking his work would see the thermal glow of a living person under the blanket, a wig of Deb's color on the pillow. It was grim work, dressing a dummy to be murdered, and Brady did it with his jaw set and his stomach turning. And last, the cruelest and most beautiful piece. He left Joe's own tamper mostly in place. He wanted Joe to do the arming himself, to make the choices with his own hands on camera, to pull the alarm and seal the flue and crack the gas of his own free and murderous will. Because a jury forgives a broken machine, but it does not forgive a man it has watched decide. Brady set the stage so that the star of the show would build the ending himself, and then he went home and held his son and did not sleep. The evening it happened was one of those still gold Mallow Lake nights where the water goes to glass and every sound carries a mile. Brady had spent the afternoon at the boathouse, servicing the Kingfisher in full view, and had shaken Joe's hand and told him, straight-faced, that the heater was repaired and the boat was safe, and Joe had clapped him on the back and called him a lifesaver, and neither of them had blinked. Then Brady had driven away, doubled back on foot through the pines, and joined the others in the dark blind on the far shore where the screens glowed. They watched Joe walk Deb down to the dock at dusk, watched him hand her aboard with a bouquet and a bottle of wine, watched the running lights of the Kingfisher slide across the darkening water into the cove and drop anchor under the first stars. What Joe didn't know was that the woman who'd stepped aboard had stepped right back off into a second boat behind the boathouse the moment they were out of sight of the house, and that the shape he tucked into the bunk, with such tenderness, pulling the blanket up, kissing its blanketed head goodnight, was a dummy. They watched him do it. They watched him climb up on deck into the clean night air. They watched him reach down into the cabin and, with a little screwdriver, pull the repaired detector off the wall and gut it again, because he trusted nothing, not even his own luck. They watched him crack the propane, light the heater, ease the hatch most of the way shut, and check his phone. And they heard him, through the mic, rehearsing under his breath the call he meant to make in 4 hours. I woke up and I couldn't. I tried to wake her up and she wouldn't. Oh God, please, she's not breathing. And on Brady's laptop, in a little scrolling green line, the carbon monoxide reading inside that cabin began to climb, and cross the number that means a person would already be asleep, and cross the number that means a person would already be dying. While up on deck, Joe Marsh sat in the clean air and waited, patient as poison, for his wife to stop being a problem. Delgado let it run exactly long enough. Long enough that no courtroom on earth could call it anything but what it was. The logger recording a lethal atmosphere in an occupied bunk, while the man who built it sat calmly a few feet away timing his alibi. Then he keyed his radio, and the dark cove lit up. 2 boats came out of the shadows with their lights blazing, and Joe Marsh stood up so fast he nearly went over the side. And in the white flood of the spotlights, his handsome, charming face did something Brady had waited 2 weeks to see. It went slack and stupid with the specific terror of a man who has just understood that the invisible thing he trusted has been visible the whole time. He actually turned and looked down into the cabin, at the poison he'd made, as if the numbers glowing on a screen he couldn't see had reached up and grabbed him by the throat. Brady stood on the deck of the second boat as it came alongside, and he didn't gloat. That wasn't in him. But he did lean over so Joe could hear him clearly across the black water, and he said the only sentence he'd rehearsed. Gas doesn't lie, Joe. It found every gap you left, and it just wrote your name. Then the deputies were on the boat, and Joe Marsh was face down on the deck of the Kingfisher, screaming that it was a mistake, that the heater was faulty, that Brady had certified it himself, and nobody was listening, because for once in his life, the loudest man on the lake had nothing anyone needed to hear. It came apart fast after that, the way these things do once the pressure's off the joint. Vivian Lorne was arrested at the Wardlow Inn before Joe had finished being read his rights, and she did the arithmetic on her own situation in about 90 seconds and decided that loyalty was for people with better options. She gave Marla Devane everything: the texts, the unsigned land deal, the plan to marry after a decent interval, the conversation where Joe had explained, proud of himself, how carbon monoxide leaves no marks, and how a fishing guide's wife dying peacefully in her sleep on an anniversary trip would be the saddest, most unremarkable accident in the county. It was all there in her own phone, because greedy, careful people are somehow never careful about the one thing that matters. Corey Massey gave his statement with his mother beside him and his voice shaking, and did not once look away. And the crown of it, the thing that made even Delgado shake his head, was that every piece of the case was built from Joe's own scheme. The boat he'd rigged to kill was the boat that convicted him. The insurance he'd doubled was the motive that damned him. The land he'd tried to sell was the greed the jury couldn't forgive. And the carbon monoxide he'd trusted to keep his secret had recorded that secret in a straight climbing line and handed it to the state. Joe Marsh had spent months building the perfect invisible murder, and a father with a camera and a data logger had simply made it visible and let Joe finish building it in front of the world. The charges were attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and, the one that made Brady's jaw tight every time he heard it, child endangerment, for the way Joe had used a 7-year-old boy as an unwitting pack mule, and then loaded him with a secret meant to help kill the child's own aunt. Old Angus Ardsley drove himself to the courthouse for the arraignment, 81 years old and straight as a piling, and he sat in the front row and looked at the man who had married into his family and tried to poison his daughter and sell his grandchildren's shoreline, and he didn't say a word, and his silence was the loudest thing in that room. Afterward, he found Brady on the courthouse steps and gripped his hand in both of his, and his eyes were wet, and all he said was, "You checked," which from Angus Ardsley was the whole eulogy a man could ever want. The trust land was never in real danger once the lawyers looked at it. Marla had been right that Joe misunderstood how it would fall, and the only thing his death plan would actually have accomplished, beyond the murder, was a legal disaster that unwound the moment he was arrested. The doubled insurance policy was voided as a matter of law. A man cannot profit from the death he engineers. Northreach Holdings collapsed under its own debts, and the boats were sold to pay the people Joe owed, and Vivian Lorne took a plea and a sentence of her own and went back to Boston in a state vehicle. The trial, when it finally came, was short, because there is not much to argue about when the jury gets to watch the defendant commit the crime. The prosecutor did exactly what Marla had said a case like this needed. She showed it in order. She put up the doubled policy, then the debt chart, then the land deal with Vivian's name on it, then Corey Massey shaking but certain in the witness box, then the photographs of the gutted alarm and the sealed flue, and then, last, she dimmed the courtroom lights and played the video. The jury watched Joe Marsh tuck a blanket around a shape and kiss its head. They watched him climb into the clean air and gut the detector with a screwdriver. They watched the green line climb on a graph laid over the footage, watched the number cross into lethal while the man sat checking his phone and rehearsing his grief. And one of the jurors, a grandmother from the North Shore, put her hand over her mouth and did not take it down for a long time. Joe's lawyer tried the only thing left to him, that the equipment was faulty and his client was a fool, not a killer. But you cannot call a man a fool while the jury is watching him gut a safety device he paid to have repaired. It took them under 3 hours. When the foreman read the word guilty on the first count, Joe Marsh finally stopped performing, and the handsome, charming face that had fooled a whole town simply came apart. And for the first time, Brady saw what had been underneath the charm the entire time, which was nothing at all. A frightened, greedy hollow where a husband should have been. He was sentenced to a number of years that meant Danny would be a grown man before Joe Marsh saw the lake again, if he ever did. Deb filed for divorce the following week, and Brady drove her to the lawyer's office and waited in the car, and when she came out she was pale but her back was straight, and she got in and looked at the lake for a while and then said, "You know what the worst part is? I'd have kept making him breakfast until the day I died. I'd never have known." And Brady said, "That's not the worst part. The worst part would have been if Danny had kept the secret. He didn't. That's the part to hold on to. Because in the end, it was always about Danny." Everything Brady did over those 2 weeks, the calm face in the driveway, the patient documentation, the slow, careful trap. All of it rested on a foundation a 7-year-old had laid when he decided, in the back seat of a car in the green underwater light, to be brave instead of loyal. Brady made sure his son understood that. He didn't tell him the whole ugly shape of it. That was not a weight for a child. But he told him the true and important part, over and over, until it went all the way in, that telling Dad had been the bravest, best, most grown-up thing anyone in the whole story had done, and that a grown-up who asks a kid to keep a secret from his own parents is a grown-up who is up to no good, every single time, no exceptions. He told him that love never asks you to be alone with something scary, that a good surprise has a day it comes out, and a bad secret just wants you to keep carrying it forever. Danny had nightmares for a while, and then he had fewer, and by the time the leaves turned, he was back down at the marina helping old Corey Massey coil lines, first mate to a better man now. Deb kept the lake house. She turned the Heron Point boathouse into a summer program that took local kids out on the water and, before every single trip, no matter how much they groaned, made them sit through a 10-minute safety talk from a quiet man about the invisible things that can hurt you and how to check for them. Brady gave that talk himself, every time. And every time he'd hold up a little carbon monoxide detector and say the same thing to the squirming kids. Gas doesn't lie. It waits in the low places while everybody's asleep. And the only way to beat it is to be the kind of person who checks. Then he'd look over at his son, coiling lines in the sun, and Danny would grin at him across the water, and Brady would think that of all the leaks he'd ever traced back to the crack, that one, the smallest one, the one that started with a scared question in a back seat, was the one that had saved a life. So that's the one that kept me up. And here's why I wanted you to sit with it, because there's a lesson in here that's bigger than one rigged boat on one lake. We spend so much time teaching kids to be polite, to be helpful, to keep their promises, and those are good things, mostly. But we forget to teach them the exception, and the exception is the whole ballgame. A predator, a cheater, a manipulator, they don't start with the crime, they start with a secret. This is just between us. Don't tell your mom. You'll get me in trouble. They test whether a child can be made to carry a secret away from the people who love them, because a kid who'll keep one small secret can be made to keep a bigger one. And a kid alone with a secret is a kid with nobody to check the story against. Brady Kilmer beat a murderer for one simple reason. His son knew, all the way down in his gut, that there was no secret in the world he had to keep from his dad. That knowledge was the alarm nobody could gut. So if you take one thing from me today, make it this conversation, and have it tonight, with whatever kid is in your life. Tell them a good surprise has an end date, and a secret that has to stay hidden forever is not a surprise, it's a warning. Tell them that telling you is never tattling, and they will never, ever be in trouble for the truth. And notice, please notice, how the man who won this thing never once raised his voice. Rage would have tipped Joe off in the driveway and gotten Deb killed. It was the calm, the patience, the willingness to follow the faint wrong smell all the way back to its source that saved her. The loud response gives your enemy the exit. The quiet one closes every door. I'm Nathan. Go have the conversation. I'll see you on the next one.